So let's talk about the Russia-Ukraine situation, more specifically, how Europe is getting cornered financially and how the US is more or less done with the entire conflict. Now, put it simply, the US cannot afford to fight multiple theaters of war, whether it's a physical conflict or financial battle. The administration is too broke to continue, and so is Europe. However, the desperation of the Europeans is reaching new heights. They are broke, but they're pledging endless support for Ukraine. And to accomplish that, targeting the Russian assets seems to be fair game. However, even their central bank thinks going after the frozen assets is a crazy idea. They are calling it illegal. The ECB is rejecting playing a role in using the reserves. Now, that is actually a smart move. At least the ECB can see a few steps ahead on how damaging this move will be. The EU Commission has asked the ECB to provide an insane 140 billion euro backstop. In other words, the ECB is to be the lender of last resort to the Euro Clearbank. The ECB was smart enough to slap away that flimsy request by saying what we all know by now: it will result in high inflation, but more importantly, it will result in a loss of central bank credibility. Here's the crazy part. Even the EU knows of the obligations of holding the frozen assets. The EU has frozen around $210 billion worth of Russian assets since 2022. Now, that is a lot of money. They are supposed to be custodians of the money, and it's not supposed to go missing. One day a peace will happen and Russia will demand the money back. It could be one of the terms. And if that happens, and if the EU doesn't have the money, it would be an international embarrassment. And that's the best case scenario. That's why they were begging the ECB to create a backstop fund just in case they need to pay back the Russians. The money would still be there. Imagine if the money is missing. Russia would most definitely pursue legal options and create an international embarrassment for them. The EU would be violating international law, and all other countries would see through the hypocrisy immediately. Now, Russia's top banker gave the EU a big warning. They could be facing 50 years of litigation if they take Russia's frozen assets. Giving the loan to Ukraine backed by the seized money will haunt Europe for half a century. Now imagine rushing everyone from Euroclear all the way to the ECB, even the Bank of France, to get their money back. This will mire the entire bloc in a never-ending legal battle. And it's not just bad PR. There are tangible and serious consequences in the real financial world. It will boomerang back on the euro, the ECB, and sovereign risk. Now, if you're China, Saudi Arabia, or any other BRICS countries, suddenly EU markets are big risk. It's literally hazardous to buy EU bonds. After all, your money could be seized or confiscated next, and this drastically reduces demand for European debt. Despite the ECB cutting rates, long-term bond yields in Germany, France are still going up. EU bond yields are also rising. The entire bloc is raising money and is putting pressure on borrowing cost in the real economy. Confiscating Russian money is bad enough if you decide to use it. Imagine the backlash. Countries that buy EU bonds will most likely store it in the earlier system, and that leaves them exposed to a confiscation event might be a Russia II situation. And that's why the ECB had to reject the move. It would destroy the perception of being independent, and issuing EU bonds will get compromised as well. Now, at least, Lagarde of the ECB is sticking straight. You cannot expect to confiscate Russian assets without big consequences down the road. Various options, and two options, as you know, have been published today in order to help Ukraine, which needs help. What I have said very clearly, and what the team around me has said, is we will do everything we can, but we will not violate the treaty. It's not that we are refusing. It's just that we are saying we have to respect the Treaty of Europe in relation to the functioning of the European Central Bank. Europe simply can't afford such a debacle, nor when they are sandwiched between two giants. Now China's eating Europe's lunch when it comes to global exports. Not a surprise when the EU keeps buying expensive energy from the US. The tariff war is also hammering down on EU's exports to American customers. Now in Q2 and Q3, Europe's trade surplus with the US is starting to fall. The total demand for manufactured goods and chemicals is also starting to plunge. Meanwhile, Europe is still buying lots of expensive energy from Trump. Should Europe's trade surplus with the US continue to drop, this will spell doom for many industries. Chances are the stimulus from various governments will balloon to unthinkable levels. But who's going to lend Europe money? China most definitely won't. The EU is part of the G7 after all, and they still have big trade barriers against Chinese goods. This can always escalate if bloc politics goes nuclear. It's not impossible for China's bond holdings to get confiscated. We are in a brave new world now. How bad is it for Europe? Well, we have France begging Beijing for money. Macron is pleading with President Xi to shrink the trade gap with China. And for that to happen, France wants more Chinese direct investment. Basically, France is broke. Many EU countries, including Germany, are in a big financial crisis because of the war and industrial collapse. They are selling much less today, and they are importing much more than yesterday. And it's why they are just so desperate to use the frozen Russian assets. They can't possibly issue more sovereign debt for Ukraine. It will just blow up the entire bond markets. Even if the EU uses the frozen assets, individual EU economies will be on a hook. Brussels would not be able to raise the money on their own to repay the Russians. And this means all individual EU countries from Italy all the way to Spain could be liable. They can't possibly raise taxes on the citizens. They will have to borrow money from investors. And we know what that means. Bond yields will go higher. Now, meanwhile, Russia's fighting back. Madov is warning that using the frozen assets is tantamount to war. Now, those are very strong words. Russia's foreign ministry has also warned that a seizure will prompt the harshest response possible, that Moscow is already preparing their own countermeasures. Most definitely, this means a counter-confiscation of EU assets in October this year, or was it last year? Russia had already drafted a retaliation plan to seize Western assets. They would execute it without delay. Many for sales have already happened. Companies like Carlsberg had their operations seized by Russia. It was put under temporary management before the assets were eventually sold off. Now, despite the sanctions, many EU companies still operate within Russia. The money is just too good and they want a foothold in the country. They want to stay in the markets, at least for now. And one of the easiest targets for Putin to retaliate is big EU banks sitting in Russia. Those are the sitting ducks. Now, EU banks like Raiffeisen are still stuck in the country. Over 10% of their assets are in Russia. The Russians have fined the bank $2 billion a while back, and they could always reach in and confiscate even more. Some banks have loan exposure to Russian companies. Putin could very well declare debt jubilee and cancel all obligations to pay. Now, can this be called a form of seizure? In this economic war, anything and everything is possible. Now, not to mention there are many other EU companies across major sectors. We are talking about food companies, apparel, chemicals, energy, and consumer goods. Those are still operating in the country and selling to Russian customers. Now that the ECB doesn't want to help, the EU Commission is coming out with bizarre ways to get the money. Van der Leyen's new scheme just doesn't make sense. It's a let's use the money now and stick the whole deal with the Russians. It's a type of reparations loan. Consider it a glorified payday loan that doesn't need to be paid back. We propose to cover all financial institutions that have accumulated such cash balances, and these institutions would have to move the cash into the instrument of the reparations loan. So, in other words, we're taking the cash balances, we're providing them to Ukraine as a loan, and Ukraine has to pay back this loan if and when Russia's paying reparations. Now, the plan is so convoluted that Europe would be better off just printing the money for Ukraine. Less complicated and, weirdly enough, probably less damaging to their reputation. And here's the funny part. Even the Americans are opposing the EU loan for Ukraine. There are reports of the U.S. lobbying EU countries to block plans to use the frozen Russian assets. And we have to understand Washington's motivation for this. Trump wants an end to the conflict and is willing to cut the Russians many concessions. Financially speaking, the U.S. is done with the war. Now, just look at their financing. The last big tranche of money, $27 billion, went out to Ukraine in Q4 last year. The next transfer was a mega $500 million in Q1. And in Q2, the money stopped completely. Trump has called it a day, and he doesn't want more U.S. money burned in a conflict. And that's why Europe is in panic mode. Their economies are in shambles, and they are left alone fighting the Russian war machine. And without Russia's own frozen assets, Europe can't hope to bankroll Ukraine for long. For the U.S., all their money and efforts have to be channeled to rebuilding their own economy. Supply chains are horribly fractured, and funding the AI race against China is still a black hole. Lots of infrastructure, including power grids, needs to be built out. Every dollar spent fighting the Russians is money not spent on U.S. domestic economy. We knew this day was going to come, and it has now arrived. The U.S. government's fiscal situation is horrible. In the first half of 2025, the U.S. borrowed nearly $990 billion from the world. But next fiscal year, during the same period, they are projecting another increase in borrowing. They would be borrowing around $1.15 trillion from global investors. That's $158 billion more. It's not sustainable. And we are reaching the breaking point. This is despite record tariff revenue from Trump's trade war. That's why we kept saying this train can't stop. If the money stops flowing, everything from Social Security to interest payments to the AI bubble would implode. The implosion would happen in a hurry. Now that we understand this backdrop, it's easy to understand why the U.S. is done with Ukraine. Financing their own economy is already a crisis. Trump can't afford to give another $100 billion to Ukraine. The U.S. gravy train has ended. But beyond this, the U.S. also has designs on the Russian money themselves. It seems that everyone wants a piece of the frozen assets. $300 billion isn't a trillion, but it's still a lot of money. In a 28-point peace plan, the U.S. also wants to utilize the Russian assets. $100 billion in frozen money will be used to rebuild and invest in Ukraine. The U.S. will get 50% of the profits, which already sounds very weird. The remainder will be invested in a separate U.S.-Russian investment vehicle. They will be used for joint projects in Pacific areas. Now, that probably means developing supply chains for rare earths. Now, it's starting to make sense. If Europe issues the loan backed by the Russian money, how will the U.S. get the entire pie? Not just a piece of the pie, but the whole pie itself. This situation is so messy. The West wants to carve up the frozen assets. Trump wants the money to rebuild U.S. industries, while Europe wants the money to fight the Russians. Now, either way, I don't think Moscow is going to get back the money. And deep down, I believe they are mentally prepared for that. What happens next will be a global collapse in trust. But let me know what you think. Will the EU really use the Russian reserves? And how will Putin retaliate? Let me know in the comments below. Stay safe.